All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Welcome to the Higher Business Series, Beyond Tokenism, What Real Consultation Teaches Us About Better Decisions. I'm Kylee Ingram, the CEO and co-founder of Wizer. At Wizer, we think a lot about consultation and the science behind decision-making. I believe humans are built to decide together, but we need the right mix of voices. Our guest today is Simon Richardson, who was previously the Mayor of Byron Bay, and he ran some of Australia's most interesting consultation processes, including citizen juries. One of the programs he ran was lauded nationally, and in the same breath, he was criticised for not being in control of the decision himself. You can't always win, can you, Simon? I'm excited to explore what you've learned and how these lessons apply far beyond politics into business leadership and any organisation trying to make better decisions. Simon, do you want to kick us off with an acknowledgement to country, since we are both on Bundjalung land today?
Absolutely. I'd like to welcome everybody who's listening in and acknowledge that we are on Arakwal Bundjalung land. I'm in Byron Bay, which for tens of thousands of years was called Cavanbar. It was a community and is a community of elders, and both existing and emerging, who are providing amazing benefit to our community, amazing advice, and an experience for us to bravely follow. So I acknowledge all of the elders past and present, and the new emerging ones which are taking the torch.
Fantastic, Simon. So you've been part of a lot of consultation. When you look back, what do you think separates genuine consultation from tokenism?
I guess it depends really on what the intended outcome is. Tokenism, it's interesting. A lot of the community members, when I was involved in local government, when I was the Mayor of Byron Shire, often mistook asking for opinions to then saying that we would enact what they said. So for some people, for example, in a planning matter, you might have 10 people in a street as part of the consultation process and an exhibition period, all say we don't want it. And then they'd say, why are you supporting it? We all don't want it. Ultimately, they weren't aware of the remit. And so that's where consultation gets really grey and murky, is that the participants may not know what the intended outcome of that consultation is. So the difference between, I guess, true consultation is when those who are feeding in their advice and information and hopefully wisdom are very much aware of what is going to happen with that input, and has an opportunity, therefore, to enact in a more empowered way. If someone doesn't know and therefore don't see the results of their input, they can see it as tokenism.
100%. It's nicely outlined there. There was one thing that you did in council that you went around the country talking about. Did it start? What made you land on citizens juries? I mean, Byron Bay, I can't even get into how tough that must be to be the mayor of everybody's diverse opinions. But there's always been there's always trust issues in government too, isn't there? So how did you come to the citizen jury decision?
Yeah. Look, I guess for perhaps some of the listeners of this fine podcast who may not be really au fait with Byron Bay and Byron Shire more broadly, it is a very strong, politically active community. It's a progressive community in many ways, but it's also quite a small town community as well, or series of communities. So on one hand, everyone has opinions in Byron Shire, which is wonderful, I guess, compared to sometimes the wider Australia, where apathy perhaps permeates more than some other places around the world. So everyone has opinions, not always informed opinions, but also, and I think more damagingly, we often don't express our opinions as graciously as perhaps we could. So what can occur over the years is people start getting into trenches. And you start to have a trench warfare of ideas and opinions between the left or the right or conservative or progressive or whatever the definitions people wish to put on them. And so as a result, people are just almost hurling missiles at each other or hurling insults and trying to win. So therefore, a good outcome is simply, did my opinion or did my group's view win out, as opposed to, was it the wisest, most informed, most nuanced opinion? So that was, in a sense, what I inherited. So there was great distrust within the councillors. There was great mistrust between councillors and council staff, and there was great mistrust between the community and council, and then within the community themselves. So I guess I really saw myself as someone who needed to, and also wanted to, get people out of the trenches, perhaps nervously but courageously, into no man's land, and to try to stop shaking fists and shake hands instead. Because ultimately, I believe humans have got amazing capacity as a community, and so really it needed communities to come together to make those sort of proper decisions to get us moving forward as a sustainable and compassionate community. So that was sort of the background of what we inherited. And I guess initially, like most government areas, community decision making often was a town hall meeting, which might have been spilling out with people who are all with their pitchforks and their flames, all ready to sort of attack anyone else in the room and sort of push their message and their view. And kind of, a fair bit of blood was spilt in those rooms. And so I was trying to avoid that too, because what that does is simply invite the normal voices, the usual suspects, so to speak, the ones who speak the loudest, the ones who think they have more, perhaps they are more self-appointed leaders, or those who just have a stronger axe to grind. And so what was obviously happening then is that the quieter, perhaps more nuanced, perhaps more considered, perhaps more conciliatory voices, those who accepted there was grey, not just black and white in issues, were often just shouted down or didn't feel safe to participate at all. And so you really weren't getting the quality of the wisdom in our wider community, which is a very informed and intelligent and compassionate community. So I guess from there, I was really trying to move beyond just that. That's got a role to a certain extent. So we started to really explore, we had some master planning processes across our towns, starting in Byron Bay, and Byron, many people in the community still do have absolute ownership, feel absolute ownership in who we are as a community and therefore how we function. So what we did to make sure was to take time with that consultation. We had all sorts of different methods, whether it be, street interactions, whether we also got a huge breadth of community groups and stakeholders around the table. We had professionals leading the process through. We had about 12 months of serious consultation to basically allow all the ideas to be gathered and percolated. And so when we started to go to town hall meetings, sharing what the findings were, there was widespread respect, at least for the outcomes. Not everyone agreed with every single point or decision and recommendation as far as how town should change, but there was a sense of co-ownership and co-design, which was really crucial. So from that, we started to get more excited and more, I guess, brave that we could push this even further. And so we started to explore the citizen jury process as one that could actually make decisions on behalf of the community from the community.
That's really cool. And you added something to it, didn't you? Because you were going to give them whatever they decided to do. You said you'd implement. Was there pushback from other councillors? Like, how did you get that one through? Because that's a real point of difference, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And so the citizen jury sort of process, the way we sort of rolled that out is, first of all, you needed a clear question to answer. So you can't just sort of do a citizen jury to say, how should we, almost from a strategic planning perspective, you can't sort of do a citizen jury to say, how should we look in 10 years' time? It's just too broad. So we needed an arrowhead from upon which the jury could just make a decision and recommendation. So what we chose was our infrastructure portfolio, which was, I think $200 million, and we spend probably $50 million, a year at least in it. So it covers stormwater, sewerage, open spaces, parks, footpaths, roads, all the boring but important infrastructure that help unite a community. So basically, we asked, our question was going to be, with the budget pie of our infrastructure, how do we want to make our slices? So how do we want to increase, for example, spending on roads? Do we want to increase spending on open parks and footpaths, et cetera, et cetera? So how do we want to spend that pie? Not necessarily growing the pie, but how do we want to change the sizes of the slices? So from there, so because we then had a very clear question, we pitched to the councillors. Our council has been a member of the IAP2, which is the International Association of Public Participation. And traditionally, there's a 5 or 6 sort of stages or processes that you can follow, starting from inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. And so they increase, I guess, in the influence of the jury. Traditionally, councils have stayed within the inform and consult sort of stages. I push very strongly to the councillors, let's go down to the empower stage, which was very rare. So basically what empower means is we will do what that jury says. We will enable it, we'll enact it, no questions asked, we'll accept it. So it's a very bold and quite scary position to take. And so your question about, or your reference to councillors being a bit nervous, we were, and I'll include myself as the true realization, became clearer of what we were doing. It was very new, it was very rare, and there's a scariness in the sense of, can we truly have faith in the wisdom of the group to the point of giving them, in a sense, the keys to the car. So from there, the way that it is governed or chaperoned as a process, and the reason why I ultimately had confidence in it, is that it's made up of 3 main points. Just like any jury in a legal sense, you need the evidence, so you need expertise, you need time to make the decision, and you also need the compact to know that what your decision will be, it will be enacted. Going back to when we spoke right at the very start, the difference between consultation and tokenism, if people don't know what their opinion's going to be used for and the degree of influence, that's what can lead them to being disillusioned when they don't see the results of their input. This was going to be very clear. You will see the results of your input because we will implement it. So with that in mind, we then went out and got a broad, just like, again, any citizen jury, we went out and try to be representative of the wider community. So from both geographic location, gender, age demographics, etc. People were cold called, whether they were interested. We paid them, a token amount, but we still paid them sort of $100 for each session. Some actually said they don't want it. They were just so thrilled to be involved to the degree that they were. Others gratefully accepted it. But we were surprised actually at how many of them just said, we didn't need that. We were just so honoured and so grateful to participate. But again, it also it sets a sort of value. When you're paying someone, you're also honouring their worth.
Did you have a sense of how many you needed at the time? Like, did you have a sense of what size your crowd needed to be as well?
Yeah, look, that was a discussion that we sort of, I guess, we just sort of ruminated as a group. We were informed by the consultant firm that works with us. They were called New Democracy. We ended up landing within that sort of 20 to 30 mark, knowing that some might fall out a bit because the process was going to be particularly over the group were going to gather over a series of Saturdays. So like a few full day Saturdays. The information was going to be shared during each sort of collective gathering. But so there was actually quite a requirement on people to participate. So we sort of, in a sense, tried to get perhaps a few more than we would normally, just in case some dropped out and that sort of stuff. That would still have a good solid cohort of over 20. I guess we thought if it's too few, again, if there's one or two members that aren't participating in a way that is galvanizing the trust in the wider group, but also getting the wisdom from the group, it could be a bit more damaging. Whereas if you've got 20 or 30, generally speaking, it's a sizable cohort to ensure that overall, what is sought is gained. So from that, we sort of left them to it. We gave them all sorts of information. So basically just like a jury who might say, can we get more evidence from this, or can we look at this again? We had staff providing all the information. And in fact, that was one of the benefits. When staff actually collated all the information about our infrastructure, what we could spend, what we can't spend, what's local government responsibility, what's state and federal responsibility, how things must be spent or not, plus then all the actual information as far as what we've got and where is it and how much it costs. We actually created a book out of that, which was so informative that we still have it available for our community that's now many years past. So just the information gathering that was part of the decision making was so valuable that it's got its own life. At the end of that, ultimately they came to a conclusion. What was interesting about that is that they decided to create a priority and a criteria starting from threat to life. So things like stormwater maintenance, which was probably a little bit lower than, for example, road maintenance or pothole maintenance, actually got elevated because for them, and rightfully so and wisely so, acknowledging with climate change and the change of weather patterns that are occurring in this area, which is storm surges, intensity of storms, landslips, heavy rainfall and floods, stormwater and making sure our stormwater infrastructure works more effectively can have a life or death implication. So for this group, it was like that needs to be more prioritised to ensure that it is more effective. So, and we therefore increased the budget for it, lessened the budget in some other areas, which didn't have that same threat to life priority.
Were you surprised by what they went with? I think you said to me, when given real power, you were surprised at the issues they went with. Because, obviously people scream about potholes and things around here. Like there's other things that seem much more popular.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to having time to truly and maturely and responsibly process information, and then also do it collectively. So you can actually listen and hear different opinions. You can sort of weigh it up. You're required to justify. You're required to consider other views. And I think when we as a society do that, we generally come up with better decisions. I think even going back to the individual, let's face it, a community is just a series of individuals. If I think about myself, the decisions I make spontaneously and in response to something generally aren't as well thought through, aren't as sustainable, aren't as nuanced or wise as the ones that I make when I can reflect beforehand, when I can consider the options without the emotion. And so it makes sense that community decision making will be the same. We have flashpoints or trigger moments or little storms of spot fires of issues which cause us to instantly react and respond and get angry or get passionate or emotional in some way. Generally speaking, though, we aren't at our best when we're making those decisions, whether we're talking to our kids, where they push a button, where they have a little spot fire, and then we respond, and then they go to bed, and we sit down and we think, ooh, wouldn't have minded that moment again. Wouldn't have minded a little bit longer to actually truly consider why they did what they did, and all of that sort of emotional human decision-making review process. So it did surprise me, their outcome, but at the same time, it probably shouldn't have. When we think about how humans operate, we are generally a compassionate, caring species who, if given enough time and enough support, will come up with decisions that reflect that.
Nice. I mean, what we're doing is based on Dr. Julia Burke's research, what we built Wizer on, and she thinks you get a 30% reduction decision error by having an inclusive leader and the right people in the room, which includes that experience and that cognitive diversity as well as other things. And I think from what I know of you, you're a very optimistic and kind, like the way you see humanity is a very kind lens. And I think it makes you that inclusive leader that is needed, for a process like this. And then you obviously found the right mix of people as well. Like you did well with that by getting rid of the squeakiest wheel, the people always speaking. They might have been there and they might have been a good part of it, but they were a part of it.
Yeah, and that's probably the one aspect where a bit of luck was involved. I mean, you can argue, I guess, that this is the thing too, if you only have 10 people in that jury, and you get, as I said, you get one or two, they can derail. Whereas when you are just doing it more on very clean and neat cohort building criteria like location, age, gender, etc., you're not necessarily looking at how they make decisions. So you could still get 30 alphas, who all sort of make decisions in the same way. That would ultimately, though, that would be unlikely, because again, if it's a cold, a clean, more deliberate, less deliberative sort of decision gathering process, most people are decision makers through many different ways. There are the quieter, there are the ones who are interested in research and development with more than just making the decision. There are more out there that are interested in how everyone else is making decisions as well, to bring everyone in. So I guess if you cast the net wide enough, you will capture enough of those. But it was open for that to be skewered, which is why I think the Wizer platform has that extra layer of authenticity, is that it can actually ensure that those types of decision making contributors are around the table. I was very content that we basically had a broad enough spectrum of decision making attributes around the table, but unless you specifically seek that, it is a little bit in the lap of the gods.
Yeah, it is. And you can, we see it in, at the top of the tree, a lot of the people are the same type of thinkers and they pick themselves. So captains tend to pick themselves in a cognitive diversity sense anyway.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, sorry. Oh, well, I was going to say, no, I don't know what you were going to say. I don't want to cut you off. What you were going to say might have been better than what I was about to say.
I would doubt it. But what I was going to say is, talk about that alpha voices. What we did find, of course, is that those who weren't around that table, they're the ones that bang the drum, in opposition, because those you often have in a wider community, and whether it could even be in a big business organisation, those who are used to having their voice listened to are the most resistant to that change. And therefore, of course, for many people who think that their opinion's worthwhile, they see the loud voices being listened to, so they have to sort of replicate or parrot that style because they think that's the only way that they can be heard. So it was actually quite interesting watching and observing the usual suspects, or the loud voices who are used to being the community leaders who weren't around the table, rather than support it, were almost inherently really quite fixed in their opposition and use their vocal outpouring to really resist this sort of new way of decision making.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to ask. Like, once it came to, what was the, did the community, do you think they trusted the decision more or less or anything? And one of our users, I think it comes from Adam Seedsman, said, "Great point, Simon. Broad enough attributes in relation to people in a group of decision makers." Yeah.
Yeah, look, as far as the wider reception of it, one of the great, well, I'll go to the negative first, because that was a minor voice, but it was an interesting one, that the local paper of whom the editor in particular and others are one of those loud voices who like they and their cohort to be heard, perhaps artificially, disproportionately, was quite outraged by the process. And even though we actually brought the media in and actually gave 2 or 3 hour overviews prior to explain exactly what it is and what it wasn't going to be, etc., they still resisted it. So while we were releasing it, the findings, that the headline of the editorial was "Council courageously avoiding responsibility." So at least they used courageously, so that was a semi-positive. I'm surprised they didn't say cowardly. But this question of avoiding responsibility, as though, like, we voted for you, you make the decision. I think where that's incorrect is that, from my perspective, my community voted for me to support my community, to, yes, lead my community, but that might be by including my community. It doesn't mean, and I think that's one of the biggest disconnects in state and federal politics, is that a party or a government will just release a policy and say, we're going to enact this. And then each side fights over it and then either vote for it. So the actual community themselves don't really get a say, other than opinion polls, as to how much they agree with it. So there's no real co-design as far as those policies. So I think in a local government, leaders are there to not just represent their community, but empower their community. So that was some of the negatives. The positives far outweighed that, because also one of the added benefits of the wider sort of collaboration or empowerment of decision making is that you then get 20 or 30 ambassadors. Those 20 or 30 people, when they came and presented to us, were so empowered, in essence, not just in word, that they were telling their friends, that they were sharing it. So all of a sudden, rather than a few councillors trying to bang the drum about, look, what have we done, there was 30 that were a wide cohort across the whole Shire, who was sharing it with their friends, who were writing articles should it be required. So in a sense, it actually shared the lift and the promotion of it, which was an added advantage, which we didn't particularly consider when we were launching it. But yeah, we had more advocates, more ambassadors, more supporters, which allowed then the wider community to really respect and appreciate the outcome.
Yeah, I love it. I loved lead community by including community. I thought that was beautiful. So what about did the other councillors too see the benefit of it? What were they doing, after the stress of deciding you'd go this way? What were they, how were they feeling once it happened?
Look, they were over the moon. And again, this is where, when you look at this sort of process and you see the richness of the decision-making process and outcome, all these extra benefits start to show themselves within the councillor body of mine. We had quite a, we had a sort of the conservative block, and we have the more progressive block, and we had various levels, along the positions along that spectrum. So some who perhaps were a bit more conservative, just in their ethos, or in their sort of life, were most nervous about it. So we sort of, to a certain degree, had to move them screaming, kicking a little bit, although they all still ultimately agreed. Those who were resistant and apprehensive at least acknowledged the openness and willingness to give it a go. And ultimately, the majority were supportive enough that they didn't, resist too greatly. But they, as the process went on, really became illuminated as to what can happen when you do ask more people. And so at the end, when the group actually presented their recommendation, and we had a couple of hours over some food, sort of a celebration or a debrief, where we could actually ask them questions and they could share their experiences. That across the board, every councillor was really proud of themselves and we as a group for doing it, because they saw they saw some of them in that group. So it wasn't just usual suspects in a sense of one particular trench, as it were. They saw that it was a very widespread community group that they could see reflected, they could see themselves reflected in. So they honoured it.
Yeah, nice. Oh, it's a great outcome. And I think, it's interesting that it must have been harder too if it's the media going after you in the negative sense, because their voice just is so much more amplified than a single voice. But it was nice that you had those 30 ambassadors out there. Now you're at Plan C. We should address the fact, you see a Plan C, and you've got more consultation in the works now. Tell us a little bit about that job and what you're doing now.
Yeah, so this organisation is really strong on supporting community when it comes to disaster resilience. So I guess if you think about a disaster response in a metaphor of rebuilding the wall after an event, things like all the main organisations that are fixing our roads and changing the levees and moving houses, they're kind of working in the bricks. Plan C works in the mortar to hold those bricks together, and the mortar is the community. How do the community, both collectively and individually, respond and cope at these sorts of moments? Not only so they can sort of bounce back, but they can actually bounce forward. In the sense that they can gain skills, psychological first aid skills, community building skills. So after every event, they're actually better placed for the next one. So part of that, and coming into this wider decision making and consultation, is helping create individuals that are skilled up in psychological first aid, in sort of disaster awareness, in how to deal with trauma, both internally and also with others, to then support them to collectivise and form generally place-based or specific areas, to then have wider community resilience groups. So that's been, and as a result, we've now got dozens and dozens of these sorts of groups across villages and towns and around the Northern Rivers. And from there, an alliance has been formed. So what's interesting with this alliance is how a decision's going to be made, how we're ensuring that we can reflect the individual intricacies of each community, empower them to respond and become resilient in a way that meets their needs against different disasters, but also within different communities, and then somehow still work together for the greater Northern Rivers benefit. Currently, we're exploring a funding opportunity, for example, where money will be able to be dictated and directed across these groups. So getting these decision making as to who's around the table, how can we disseminate the information that's required, how can we listen to those individual community groups to ensure that what that little village needs and wants is different to the other, but they're both valued, they're both honoured, and they're both supported. So it's a really exciting process, and it's one that is deeply important because, as we know currently and going into the future, it's going to be how resilient we are and how we can respond to challenges that's going to define us. Just like individually, we're all great when things are fantastic, but our true value and our true definition of ourselves can be when things aren't. And so as a community, it's the same. So we're working in that space to make sure that whether it be me talking to my friends on a daily basis and interacting with my friends who might have different things going on in their life, to then when a disaster happens or is looking to happen, how can we galvanize and strengthen each other as a community?
Yeah, fantastic. And you're not a guy that sits with the status quo. So I can't wait. Is there anything you're looking at and you think, oh, I could do that? Like, because I guess what you're going to, like, we have a lot of natural disasters up here. Northern rivers, we're very good at floods. Do you think there's things that you're going to take from this that will be applicable nationally and globally? What's your, I mean, you've only just started, so I don't want to say, Simon.
Well, look, the work and the training that we provide actually can be replicated nationally, and is starting to be replicated nationally. We're starting to get people coming from Adelaide, from Queensland, to our training modules to take back elsewhere. And we're also starting to look at different aspects and different cohorts within our community. Look specifically, say, for example, the queer community, specifically for younger people, for those who have got ability challenges. All of those specific sort of cohorts can have different needs when it comes to pressures of disasters and response, and how they interact with the wider community. So we're actually tailoring some of the consultation and the training to meet different needs. Learnings from that can then be rolled out nationally and internationally, because from a human level, we are so more similar than we are different as far as our emotional reaction to these sort of challenges. And, one of the biggest lessons we've got, especially from the last perhaps decade, is that there's hardly a community in the world that's immune to disasters and natural and extreme weather events. So it now it's not just about those at-risk communities, because we're all at risk. So this is going to be the exciting thing too, as far as that sort of decision making. And again, is how do we make sure that when we are discussing wider community responses and adaptation plans or resilience sort of training, how can we make sure all the voices and all the wise counsel across our community is obtained and gathered and adds to our decision making? Because just like anything, our response to a disaster could still have the same loud voices saying the same things. So this is where, I guess, through both the wonderful work that Wizer is doing, or the citizen jury sort of process, it's galvanized me to really drill down to make sure that any of these sorts of decision makings that go across communities still honor and value and accept the different ways that we make decisions and the different decisions themselves.
It's one of the things you see too with disasters is it can't always be your traditional leadership that steps up, because it happens in micro community. It's like it all is off. It's the stories of these people coming together, and how do you build that resilience and that the trust in that decision making when they come together in the moment of need. It's a different way of looking at it too, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And what we do know when it comes to disaster response and disaster preparation and resilience is that the system simply cannot do it alone. It will be from the community. There can't be a fire truck in front of every house. There can't be an ambulance in front of every house. There can't be sandbags or the SES or the Army or Red Cross in front of every house on every street. So therefore, and that is true globally. And so what we find and what we have found in these cases of extreme disruption, it's the community that is often the first responders. It's the community that's generally the first reaction and response and rebuilding section. You know, I was talking to someone just the other day who talked about their experience of COVID in Spain, which had a very different reality to we in Australia. You know, they were in apartments with, and across the road there was an aged care, 97% fatality in that entire apartment building within a few months, where government was just leaving body bags on the streets and in front of apartment buildings for residents to sort of deal with. And so straight away, whole apartment blocks, communities just stepped into that space of looking after each other, of looking after those who are deceased, of getting the help and care for those who were most vulnerable, who looked after each other creatively and compassionately. We had degrees of that in this country, but other parts of the world, it showed very clearly that, you know, in these moments of crisis, it is the community that will step into the space that's most needed. And so therefore, again, how we can make our decisions, how we can empower the breadth of ideas and personalities and characters, the more robust and resilient we'll be.
Yeah, and I guess in those situations, it's not something you can ever prepare for. You can prepare for it, but you end up in these situations you've only heard of. It's not like, you know, a normal occurrence where you're, you know, doing something. You're so far out of your comfort zone, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And, you know, how people behave with that is difficult.
Yeah, and this is where I guess we have this idea of bouncing forward, not just bouncing back, because each experience that we go through, the lessons from should make it more fertile moving forward. So again, going from that decision-making process with council, doing it once makes it easier to do it again, because you can learn, you can refine, you can tweak, you can strengthen the areas that work to make sure that the next one's even better. And it's the same as any sort of community decision-making, any community response. You learn from what works. You then understand that it can happen again, and it most likely will happen again. So what things can we put in place? So even, for example, going back to that analogy of when you're in a plane and you're told that if there's an emergency, you put the air to your own mask, you put the mask to your face first before you look after the kids. Same thing that we can train our community and empower our community, that if an event is imminent, we look after ourselves first in the sense of our own psychological well-being. So therefore, we are better placed that when things are starting to occur, we can be more effective and more supportive of others when the time comes. So we can prepare. You know, it's almost like the emotional sandbagging, the psychological, the community building sandbagging that can allow us to prepare for things in advance, knowing that they're coming. And that's why it's really crucial to get the decision making of that community really robust. So therefore, when we share, our preparedness and what we can do to be prepared, it's authentic to people. So therefore, they'll adopt it and apply it.
Yeah, super interesting. And sorry for the dog. He's had an operation and he's like, I don't know whether it's been distracting because he keeps. Anyway, he's now in shot because he is being quieter here. So sorry about that. I guess too, like, you know, we're talking about politics, government, and, you know, now resilient communities. What would your piece of advice be to, you know, other leaders, you know, corporate leaders or other? What do you think you've taken away? It's something that you fundamentally see now in all leadership situations? What advice do you wish other leaders understood?
Look, I think we can't underestimate taking time to co-design and collaborate. There's the old carpenter's mantra of measure twice, cut once. I think if we look at decision making in that same way, rather than just a small group saying, let's make the decision and then we'll sort of deal with implications afterwards, it's better to, I guess, if the two measurements are co-design and collaborate, then cut, then make the decision. And by co-design, I mean, the more we can bring the people who are going to be recipients of our decision into the process of that decision making at the start, the outcome will be seen as authentic because they'll see themselves in the process. When we just land something in front of people and say, this reflects you and this is a decision that's going to impact you, and they can't see themselves either in that decision or how it was even arise, that's where this concept of tokenism can come from. If you can bring groups in to co-design the process, so how should we make this decision? If this is a decision that needs to be made, how best should we make this decision to ensure that it's the most empowered, most authentic, most inclusive one, the better. Then we can collaborate on the process. So we get the process right, we then get people joining us in the process, then we get a decent outcome. And so that's the same whether it's an organisation. You get your wider organisation or business involved in how best we make this decision. And again, a friend of mine who's in a similar position to me said to me, "Oh, well, that's my role. I'm the CEO. That's what I do." And I think that mentality is certainly can make quick decisions, but doesn't necessarily make the wisest decisions unless you are an omnipotent being, which very few of us are. So I think it's not only just more courageous and more inclusive. I think it's actually a smarter process to bring in other voices and those who use their voices in different ways to make sure the process is more robust, authentic, and then you can roll it out and it'll be received and it'll be a living and breathing and supported decision.
Yeah, I guess with those leaders we see that say, "Oh, it's my decision," we say, "Well, how do you delegate with certainty?" And that gets their ears up. They're like, "Oh, I don't know how the information comes to me, or it just comes to me." And there's a few interesting things in that. One of the early data points we're seeing is that 40 to 60% of our recommendation engine, because our recommendation will say, "Hey, you don't have the right group for this decision." 40 to 60% of those people had not been in a panel before. So you're also leaving your untapped resources on the table, aren't you? And who might be the leaders that aren't those people that want to talk out at every meeting or whatever, but are deep and thoughtful thinkers.
And absolutely, and I think what that can do is start to embed almost a knowledge base and security for when quick decisions need to be made, because there is a reality sometimes where those who are in charge of certain departments just need to make a call, even in times of emergency or in times of just not everything has the time to percolate as we may wish. But the more that I think those in leadership positions have seen the value of the wider group and seeing what's resulted, the more they start to take on the characteristics, I think, of that decision making. They begin to value the different perspectives, and so they're more likely, certainly rather than less likely, that when they need to make a quick decision, they might start to embed or have those different perspectives and decision-making considerations in their own quick decision-making. So it makes them better and more widely considered decision makers.
100%. And I think, it goes back to that thing you were saying about buy-in as well. They get the buy-in, they get, people, it reduces things like, disengagement, which is a huge problem in organizations. I think it's $550 billion in the US a year, disengagement, like $3,000 for every 10,000 of wage. So it's all those things about people are important. People are what, makes your company good or bad, isn't it? So
because people necessarily, not everyone necessarily wants their voice to be heard, in the sense that they don't necessarily want to speak, but they want to be valued, and they want to be able to see decisions that clearly value who they are. If people aren't valued, and often an easiest way to feel valued is if someone says, "Well done, you've done a great job," or "That's a great point." That's an easy way to feel valued. But for those who perhaps don't seek that verbal affirmation, they still want to be able to feel that their contribution to that wider body is valued. And so even if they can have a voice, whether verbally or non-verbally, if they can have an input into decision to the point where they can see themselves in that decision, that will inherently make them feel valued. And that's crucial. If you don't feel valued, you start to, it becomes a toxic environment where you are.
Yeah, 100%. And toxicity is, one of the main things that we see in orgs. So that is a beautiful thing to leave it on, Simon. People feeling valued. Is there anything else we think you want to say about consultation before we leave them today?
Look, I guess just one thing I would probably say is all of this requires constant pursuit, constant review, constant change. Nothing is set. It still everything requires champions to be pushing new ways of thinking and new methods of thinking. But it also requires ongoing work, just like any relationship. When you start working on a relationship, it starts to atrophy. Just recently in Byron the other day, there was another town hall meeting about an issue where it spilled out of the room and similar voices were yelling. And so you kind of think, wow, how much have we done? How far have we progressed? It's all of these sorts of human-based decision-making, human-based engagement, resilience, connections, that nothing's set in stone. So it requires us to not only implement and install, create the framework for great decisions, but we still need to be engaged with it, continue with it, develop it, so it becomes more and more embedded. Otherwise, when we look around globally, we can go back to what looked like the 1930s very quickly as how communities interact with each other. So it's not a linear line that's inevitable. It requires all of us to be courageous in getting other voices around us as much as we can.
100%. And we're in an age where social media is supercharging us into different pots and making sure we stay there and scream at one another. So it's hard. It's even hard. It's harder than it's ever been to make that happen. But if you want to be a good business or a good community, you have to do it.
Absolutely. And again, just like going back to the human, if you want to be a good father, you want to be a good parent, you want to be a good partner, we need to keep pushing ourselves to listen better, to provide space for different opinions and different ideas. Otherwise, we're a herd animal. We need each other.
Yeah, we do. I really want to do an episode on the science behind us being decision makers together. That'll be a good one too. Well, Simon, thank you so much. Let's leave your wisdom there for the day. So much more that you could have given us. I love it. Have clear questions, the right people. It was a bit of luck, but there is science behind that. And leading your community by including community was beautiful. So thanks for joining us today, Simon, and sharing the story about great consultation processes. Till next time. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.